Good afternoon. My name is Daria Orlowska. I am the data librarian at Waldo Library, and today we will be discussing how to successfully manage your graduate projects. So I created this workshop to address research projects related to your thesis or dissertation work, but all of these concepts can be used and be applied to classroom and internship projects alike. So I hope that regardless what you're working on, what you came here for today, you will get something from this workshop. A little bit of background about me. I am the data librarian here, but I was also a research assistant for 4 years. So a lot of this presentation is me drawing on my experience, coordinating research studies, and things I have learned along the way to impart to you as you start with your projects. So without further ado, let's begin. So at the end of this workshop, you should be able to understand what is data management and list off the different components of it. You'll be able to construct a workflow to identify your data needs, consider strategies to address those needs, and then gain an awareness of some campus resources. And this workshop is really meant to guide you through some data organization and management questions so you can start thinking about how to apply them to whatever data you have. Due to the fact that there's a lot of content to explore, I'm not going to be doing a deep dive into any one of these concepts. But that being said, I am happy to take any questions during the workshop, so feel free to either write it in chat, I will be keeping an eye on that, or ask me directly if you are brave enough to unmute yourself. So what is data? I want to start with this because I mentioned data management, but I'm sure that everyone has a different definition here. So it is a fact, a collection of information, and depending on what discipline you're from, you might have different definitions of what you consider to be data. The Office of Science and Technology Policy Memo defines it as factual material necessary to validate research findings, including data sets. However, for the purpose of this workshop, anything can be data. It can be measurement, field, or survey data. It can be audiovisual, like videos, audio or music, photos, textual data such as transcripts, Word documents, bodies of literature, tweets, physical objects from a collection or a specimen, and even code. Data can be born digital, so existing only in a digital format, analog, or existing as a physical material or digitized when we convert something that's physical, like something that's on paper, into a database. So regardless of what kind of data you work with, all of these principles you can apply to it. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on is project workflow, which is your roadmap for streamlining the process and identifying your purpose. Project workflow is a great way to brainstorm what data you are interested in, how this data connects to each other, and envisioning the process going forward. Your roadmap may change, but by spending some time at the beginning of the process putting down this information, you should be able to eliminate the guesswork of this information and streamline the process. The workflow can be created with post-it notes on a table or just on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard in your PowerPoint, whatever works best for you. Just make sure that whatever you're doing, you're taking a picture of the final version for your record if it's not in a digital format. So I always encourage individuals who are working on a project to start with the workflow because, like I said, it's a very easy way to get your thoughts sorted. You want to identify what data you're interested in, consider where this data is coming from. Sometimes when you're doing research projects or if you're just doing internship projects for class, you might have different things that you're drawing on, different sources. And so it's important to identify those, how access may vary between them, what are the different variables you'll be looking at, the data types, if maybe you want to decide on a unique identifier. So if you have different data points, like what is the one thing that makes it unique, and then establish some orders of operation. So what are your questions and what do you want to do in what order? So here's an example of a project workflow for an internship project that someone actually worked on. So in it, there are a few things to consider. So these are digital post-it notes since we're in a digital environment, but they could just be done using regular post-it notes on a table. So you have a few different sources. You have four sources here. So you have the course catalog, library notes, and library statistics. And if you notice that they have different sources, so how do you access this information? And then there are different variables that the student was interested in. So they were interested in, for this project, looking at what materials instructors use for their courses, specifically materials from the Rare Books and Manuscript Library. So they were interested in who was using this information for what course and what were the materials. So based on those, they wrote out some data, some variables that they could expect to obtain. And you have course name and book ISBN highlighted in purple because those are the identifiers. So the course will always be unique, and so will the book ISBN, whereas the title or department could be very similar, or even like the instructor name could repeat across disciplines. So this is a good way to get your thoughts organized so you know what you're collecting and in what format. So if you look at visit date, you have it in year, month, day. So that is the format you'll be looking at. And these can change, but it's a good place to get started. So after you have established your workflow, you've kind of gotten your ducks in a row, you can move on to data management. Data management is how you organize, structure, and care for the data that you have. I often say that data management is a kindness to yourself and to others because doing a good job taking care of your data means that your future self can have the context and access to reuse your data, even when it's been a while since you've looked at your project and you may have forgotten some details. There are several components of data management that we'll be talking about today. So of those are file naming, which is structuring your data in a way that enables you to locate the right file without second guessing yourself or wasting time. You have documentation, which is providing context so that you and sometimes others can revisit and reuse your data. You have backup, which is making sure that you always have a copy of your data to access, and who is responsible for doing that, making sure that you can access the data. And sharing, which is not only receiving recognition for your work, but also advancing research if you're sharing research data, or if you're working on a project with several people, sharing that information with them, or in an internship. If you don't have research data, or if that's not what you wanted to work on today, I encourage you to think of sharing also as long-term preservation instead. Steps that you can take to ensure that you will always have access to the files, whether it's 1 year from now or 10 years from now. How can you make sure that you can revisit a project in the future? So these data management steps can roughly be organized into tasks at the project setup, in the active phase when you're actually doing the work, and then at the end of the project. However, I'd encourage you to revisit some of these data management steps throughout your project, documenting as you go and finalizing at the end, as well as evaluating if the structures you set up still make sense. So it can kind of look like this. And because file naming and documentation are so important, that is what we're going to spend the majority of the time talking about today, though we will talk about the other ones as well. Let's see here. So next we will go through each of these to give you a better sense of what they might look like within your project. So this is an example I like to use kind of as a fictional student's files from the comic Piled Higher and Deeper. So this is a bit of an extreme example. I don't know how many of you have had files that you've had to keep working on and you kept renaming, and eventually it loses a little bit of a sense of what the file meant. So you have test, retest, calibrate, all of these don't really tell you what steps were taken, what is the most recent file, which one you should be using, and it's not clear enough to know what is useful. And if you move some of these to a different folder accidentally, you might not be able to find it again because it isn't unique enough to find um, based on just the name here. So while this is a bit of an extreme example, and maybe some of your files do look like that, I did want to present you with an example um, from one of my projects to look at. We can talk a little bit about that. This is a project that I started working on when I began working at Western. And I didn't take a whole lot of time to think about my file naming conventions or how I wanted to structure the files. So take a moment, go ahead and look at this. Tell me what you see here. How is this data structured? Like, what is the most, based on looking at this, what is the most important thing about these files that I seem to care about when sorting them? So one of the things that it does well is it sorts by date. So yeah, so there's categorizing, exactly. So maybe like some of the files are structured together, some of the same types of files. Um, then you have things that are sorted by date, but then you have things that aren't sorted at all. And so one of the things that was really frustrating to me when I've revisited this in the future is I had a really hard time finding what the scripts actually were going to do. I don't know if you see this. There are some files that are .ipnyb, which are Python files, and the names themselves, 6 months, even a year from when I started the project, didn't make any sense to me. So I actually had to click in and look at what I did. And this became a little frustrating when I had to rerun the project in 2022 at the beginning of this year, and I ended up just copying a bunch of files and putting in into a new folder because every time I looked at this, I couldn't tell what I was supposed to use. So that's something to think about, right? Like if you have a project that you're thinking about revisiting in the future, that you actually sit down and think of, oh, what is the most important thing here? Um, One of the things I will point out is that there's an outdated folder, which could be useful to you if you know for sure, like you've done some tests and these are files you're not going to reuse. But thinking about how you're sorting and what's the most important piece of information is something to that could be important to think about. So here is an example of a project that I did sit down and thought about quite a bit of, I spent quite a bit of time thinking about the file structures and the naming conventions because I knew I wanted to put this information online. So how does this differ from the example that we just saw? What is something that immediately jumps out at you? It's sorted alphabetically, yeah, so it's easy. You're dividing things up into folders. There's a lot more folders in this one, and there's subfolders, so it keeps going. Yeah, there's a lot of consistency. So if you look, the dates change, but the file names themselves kind of stay the same. And that makes it really easy for me because I really cared about the different dates. And so that was the first thing that I wanted to sort on. And then I made sure that I had a standard name at the end of the extension so that I could do something like this, where I can use the built-in window function to search for uh, over here COVID bed PPE, which is the downloaded data structure, which tells you how many COVID cases are in hospitals right now. Um, and use because everything was so consistent, I could just search for them and all the files would pop up. And then I could copy and paste those files into a different folder, or I could easily find what I was looking for in that case. So if you are working either alone, but especially if you're working with other people, I would strongly suggest that you establish a file naming system. So it can take different, it can look very different, but this is an example of one from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from an actual lab, the draconian and non-negotiable naming system created by Pat, where it's very clearly spelled out what are the different components that this lab group cares about. So you have a project name. When you choose a few of the examples, you have an experiment name, the type of file, and the date. The structure is very clear of what it looks like, and this really helps when you are working with more than one person. I'm sure that you have all worked with someone, and if you haven't decided on how you were going to name things, everyone named things however they wanted, and that makes files very difficult to find. This is especially important for research projects, but it is also important for class projects or internships or anything you're going to share with other people. So in this case, the author has decided that the most important way to sort their files is by project, followed by experiment group, file type, and then date, which is kind of different than what you saw for my example, where my priorities were the date, followed by the main type of file, followed by the subtype. And this can vary depending on what your priorities are. But this file naming system also provides a controlled vocabulary for individuals to use and to provides directions for use and provides an example. So this is something that you could replicate in your own work. So to summarize, consider the following when embarking on file naming. Decide if you need a file structure and come up with one that is unique from your other files, avoiding creating a folder that is simply labeled data for all your research projects or class projects or whatever you might be dealing with. The system should be logical to you and easily understood by others. Then create a file naming system that describes the logic behind your naming schema. Decide on what information is the most important that you will use for sorting. If you can provide a controlled vocabulary like we saw in the example before, in the form of a list that someone can pick from, that's really great. And then decide how the system is accessed so that it is followed. Do you print out the file naming conventions and tape it to your computer screen so you can always see it? Do you put it at the top of a file structure in like a plain text file? And then after that, when naming files, avoid using spaces and special characters to make your files machine readable. This is a rule that you could break depending on what you're doing. If you are using a script or some sort of programming language, it is good not to use special characters because you can't read those in. There's also limits to what special characters you can use if you're using like a Windows machine, and I'm sure like an Apple machine as well. If you're writing a date, it is good practice to use the ISO standard. So that's year, 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 month, month, day, day. Because if you're doing any sort of sorting, then it will sort by something that changes the least, followed by things that change more. And if you're collaborating with someone who might not be from the United States or who might be an immigrant here, then it will be clear what the actual date is. I would also consider software limitations. For example, if you're working with mapping data, ArcGIS will not read in files that start with numbers. So putting the date first would not be a good strategy. In addition, certain software may have character limits or provide limited space for file names, so it might be worth creating shorter file names to actually see the files you're working with. So before we move on to documentation, I want you to take a moment to just reflect. You can jot this down on a piece of paper or just think about it. What file naming conventions might work well for your own project and files? And what is the most important thing you want to search for within the project? And do you need to create a file structure with folders? Would that be more helpful? So just take a moment and think about a project that you're working on, or maybe one that you had in mind when attending this workshop, and consider where applying structure like this would be helpful. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on unless anyone has any questions, and feel free to type those into chat. I will do my best to answer them. But in the interest of time, I will move on to documentation. Our next data management component is documentation, which I think can be succinctly explained as serving to provide a clear explanation of the thing you are documented, along with a clear process for work with the thing. So depending on the thing you are documenting, you might have different needs in regards to detail and workflow. This is an example that you might encounter in quantitative research projects where the entire project might have a single methodology, which includes things like what was done, what instruments or software were used, and if they require a specific software version. But the project might have several types of data files that need to be listed out. And then the data itself, which includes a code book and a listing of variables. So it gets more specific. So if you drill down even more, you might have a specific point or a variable, and you've made some decisions on how to group or transform them. They might have units that you want to talk about, and you might also want to include some decisions about how to identify missing data or what you did with missing data. So essentially, depending on your project, you might have different needs. You might start really broad and you might go very specific. And you can easily substitute quantitative data for qualitative data, where you might have a grouping of text files that you organize into themes and perhaps used code to conduct text mining on, or maybe a set of pictures in a collection that are grouped by a theme, or scientific modeling in MATLAB that contains codes and outputs in the form of images and text documents. So next we will explore some examples of documentation and consider pros and cons of each to give you a sense of what different types there are and what might work for your project. So the first one here is code commenting. This is a Python script I created in Jupyter Notebook for a project that explored creating connections on campus through linking faculty to research topics. So in here, because Jupyter Notebooks allows you to create things in plain text, commenting out your code is a great way to provide you with instructions on what each line does so that you can easily replace files, make alterations, and figure out the purpose of each line, even if you haven't used it for a while. So in this case, I have like a title and I have the purpose of the project, what this piece of code was supposed to do, and I have some files that are defined and what each of the lines do. However, the commenting might not provide you a good overview of what the code accomplishes without actually clicking into it. So depending on the software you're using, it might be more or less difficult to access your code without having the same software that you used to initially do the coding. And it also doesn't do a great job creating associations between files or describing what files are part of your project. So if you have different pieces of code that are working together, it might be harder, to link those two together or figure out what files were created as a result of this code. But it is, in general, a good practice as like an active part of research to make comments when you're coding so that you know in the future what you did and why you did it. Next is an example of documentation within a spreadsheet. So this is an Excel spreadsheet that includes documentation about tracking workshop attendance and feedback. It includes reference to what the variables mean and how they were derived, as well as some file naming conventions. So the pros of this is that the documentation is contained within a file in a separate sheet, so that is always linked to the data and you can always reference it. However, Excel is a proprietary piece of software, so maybe not everyone can open it and access this documentation. In addition, if you save your file into an open format like a CSV, you lose the ability to have that piece of information be linked to your data. So it saves it as different spreadsheets. And anything that you have highlighted or formatted will be lost if you migrate to a CSV, which is the open version of a spreadsheet, or even if you migrate between different types of files. So this is what happens if you migrate over to a CSV. You lose your sheets at the bottom and all your highlighting and formatting. It still might give you some idea, but it's not linked to anything. So if you've saved it in the wrong place, it can be easy to lose track of. So the best suggestion when it comes to documenting something in a spreadsheet is that it can live in the spreadsheet, but if you're going to preserve it for long-term use, it is good to put it in a plain text document that lives with your data so that it is easy to access by any program. Okay, the next thing I want to touch on is a codebook. This is a documentation for a data set specifically, and that was deposited into a repository. So what the codebook does is it kind of drills down. If you think about the introduction to documentation where you had the overview of the project and it kept getting more detailed as you went further down into the weeds, so to speak. This really touches on the variables. It tells you what are the different variables within your data set, what format they're in, the description of them, what can you expect, like what the type of variable is. So is it a number? Is it a piece of text? Are there any missing variables? And how many, like how were they handled even? So it can include things like missing data was omitted, or if someone responded in this way, it was replaced by this number, or sometimes in different fields you can include dummy variables. So in psychology, for example, it is common practice to put 999 for missing variables, whereas in other disciplines you might leave it blank or put NR for no response. So this is a great place to put that kind of information in as well. And the last piece of documentation that I wanted to talk about here is the README file. And the README file is really the overview of your documentation. So when we have the code book, that really looks at just the data points. This one looks at the whole thing, so your entire project. So this is really great for telling you what the purpose of the project is, who is involved, what kind of system requirements might be used um, in order to get into it and work with the files, and what the specific files are and how they link up to each other. So this is an example of a data education game I created and the documents that were part of it for someone to replicate this game. It, the README file is in a plain text document, so it's very easy for people to open and get into, and it points to the different files that are connected to each other and how you can open them and reuse them. However, like well-done code books, README files can also be very consuming to put together. Any sort of documentation, the more specific and more detailed it gets, the more time it takes, unfortunately, because you have to put in the time to do it. It is a standalone document that needs to be done well because if it's done incorrectly, it might not be very helpful. So here's another example. It's a little bit it has less information, but it still has like who was involved in the project and what are the files. But I've also seen README files done like this. This might be a simplification, but just saying this is my project, it's got 3 files in it, isn't going to help you in the long run. So kind of having a sense of, what are the different things you want to cover in your documentation that might help you later on is it's good to think about so that you make sure that you're putting that information in. Okay, so to summarize, adequate documentation is having enough information about projects, methods, and materials such that the information is maintained over time in an accessible format and it is valuable to those who need it. We talked about how different data might need different details of documentation and went through a few examples of what documentation might look like depending on your project or different types of data. And I just want to say that it's a time-consuming process. I think I've mentioned it already, because when it's done right, you've put in the time and you don't have to figure things out from scratch later. Even if you are in the middle of a project and you haven't documented anything, starting at the middle of the project and documenting as you go on is still better than not doing anything, because at least then you're in the active phase and you remember what you're doing and you can make some notes and then go back to the rest of it later. So, some things to consider. Are there any documentation standards in your field, such as formal schemas, that you should be taking into consideration? And if so, how difficult and time-consuming will it be to adopt them? Will you have access to the documentation in the future, even if you no longer have access to the software you used to create it? How easy would it be to extract or aggregate the documentation? So this kind of goes back to if you have documentation within a spreadsheet and you want to take out all the documentation from the spreadsheet, or if you have an image and you put all the documentation in the properties part of the window, how easy is it to take out all that documentation and put it into one file? And what documentation would you require in order to pick up the process in a year and know which files to use? So you can have different types, different levels, depending on what is important to you. You might have like a basic README template that's a text file that just kind of has some basic things to fill in. The barrier is very low for that. However, the quality might also be low depending on how much time you put into it. Or you can use something that is a metadata schema, like what you see on the right-hand side, which might be a standard for certain discipline to have things very structured, but it is going to be way more time consuming, though you'll have a lot more detail. So just some things to consider. And like we did for file naming conventions, I want you to think about your project, and I want you to consider what documentation do you currently have in place? What does it not have? And what can you do? What do you need to put in there so that you will be able to reuse your project in the future in, say, a year? So just take a moment and think about that for a second. And I'll also take any questions at this point. If you have any, feel free to type it in or unmute yourself. Okay, we're almost there. We've gone through file naming conventions and documentations, and then here are a few other things to consider within your project when you're managing it. So storage and backup. I don't know how many of you have been unfortunate enough to run into the blue screen of death or lose things that you put your data on. Maybe you had it in an external hard drive and that external hard drive failed, or you had your computer stolen, or your backpack that had all your notes, or maybe you had a flash drive and you misplaced it. It's not great when that happens, and so it's important to consider if you were to lose the ability to access where you have data and you really need this data to complete a project because you're doing research or because you're collaborating with someone, do you have a spare copy somewhere that you could access if something goes terribly wrong? So there's a rule that we like to follow for backup, which is the 3-2-1 rule. And that's store 3 copies of important files on at least 2 different media types, with one being in the cloud, so or at least one offsite. So there are a few resources on campus that can actually help you with that. So you could decide that you want to store things on a laptop, and maybe you back things up into an external hard drive. And you are connected to your OneDrive account, which stores things in the cloud. So even if you accidentally delete something or your computer dies, you have a copy of that important file somewhere. Things to consider about your storage type is how much stress and time would it take you to replace your data files? How much time, stress, and what is the price of that? If the answer is that it's very high, I would strongly suggest that you look into creating another copy of your file. If you are, it also depends on what your data project is. So if you're working on a class project, how important would it be to recreate something? If you're working in a group or lab, uh, what are the different options that might work well for that group? And it is also important to consider who is responsible for creating the backup and how often is a backup being created. Oftentimes, if you don't think about it, it might not get done. And if you don't designate someone, it might not get done. So it might be that you are the person you are designating, but creating kind of a schedule like, oh, once a month I'll back everything up, or I'll put everything into the cloud every day so I don't have to worry about it. Good things to keep in mind. Um, in addition to storage, I would strongly urge you to consider versioning to prevent your data loss from being overwritten, or in the case that you need to access an earlier file because you made some changes to a current one that weren't actually what you wanted. So there's a few options of versioning on campus. You can either do automatic versioning through OneDrive or Google Drive, or you can manually integrate a numbering system into your file naming conventions, and then opt to create a new file every time you save instead of saving over the current file. So those are 2 different ways that you can approach it. So just so that if you've never done file versioning, what it looks like is, so in OneDrive, you actually have to access it through WExchange on the browser. You can't access it through the desktop. But if you go into OneDrive and find your file, you'll find 3 dots next to the file, and you'll be able to see all the versions and then restore the one you're interested in. For Google Drive, it is very similar. If you put things into Google Drive, which I think you can set things up to automatically import or either import it in through the web browser. You go into the file and you manage the versions and find the one that you're interested in. I think there is a limit to how many files are kept within Google Drive. I think it's 100. Could be wrong about that. And there is also a limit to OneDrive, but I think it's larger. Keep in mind that as a student, your access to OneDrive and Google Drive associated with your WMU account will expire 1 month after you graduate. So make sure that if you are using this as a versioning or storage option, that you move your files before then, because you will permanently lose access to them, and I don't think there is a way to get them back. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about today is long-term storage and sharing. So why might you consider long-term storage for your project? If you're conducting a research project at the university, especially a human subjects research project, you're required to keep it for 3 years after the study closes. There's also a chance that if you are doing a project right now for a class, or for your dissertation or thesis, or even as an internship, you want to revisit it at a later date. Or you might get a request from like a colleague or classmate to see your data. So oftentimes we think of sharing as long-term storage, because if you are depositing your data into a data repository, these repositories commit to not only making your data findable, but also helping you store data for a long time, anywhere from 10 years to indefinitely, with multiple backups in case anything goes wrong. So data repositories are a good solution for your research data. There are some caveats to that, but generally that's something that I would encourage you to consider if you have research data. Of course, it's not going to work for maybe your classroom projects or internship projects. But even if you have been making your files findable and documenting your process and creating backup copies, your data is only as good as your access to it. So that's another component to think about when thinking about long-term storage. If your data is in a format that requires certain hardware or software or a specific version of the program to open it, and that you only have access to that program or hardware while you're a student on campus, then all your prep was useless because you can't actually get into the data you've prepared for long-term storage. So when working with a proprietary piece of software or maybe a unique tool, consider transferring your data into an open, uncompressed format for long term so that you can always use it. So if you are in an Excel spreadsheet and you have Excel access through Microsoft 365, consider putting it into a CSV, because if you lose access to the Microsoft suite after you graduate, you will always be able to open the CSV. If you're working with a piece of software to create data, consider putting it in a plain text file or a CSV file or a PDF, something like that. I also want to briefly touch on data sharing. This is probably only going to be useful to you if you have research data, if you're conducting research as part of your thesis or dissertation. It especially is relevant if you are on a grant that requires data to be shared, or if you're thinking about submitting an article to a journal that has a data sharing requirement. So in that case, sometimes they write out where they want you to submit your data set. Other times, they won't write anything, in which case you can put your data into a generalist repository. So here are a few main ones: Zenodo, Figshare, Mendeley Data, and OSF. These are free. They do have a file limit, but it's usually like between 5 and 20 gigabytes. And they make your data set findable, and which helps with research reproducibility. And you are also getting credit for the work you're doing. Like, putting a data set together is a lot of work. As we talked about, you have to think of the file naming conventions, you have to document everything. By putting your data set into a repository, you are oftentimes creating a DOI, which is an identifier for your data set, and you can put that into your CV as a publication. That is work that you have done. That is something that you should be proud of and you should get credit for. So the first you will also want to consider before you do that is whether your data can be shared. If it contains identifiable information, you might be working with human subjects data, which gets a little bit tricky. So a lot of the times you have to write in data sharing into the consent form. So you must make sure you do that, or you can't actually share your data set later on. You should also consider whether you've de-identified your data enough or aggregated it in order to share it. Other things to consider when sharing a data set is, does your data set require an embargo? So do you need to lock it for a certain amount of time before your publication gets accepted? And what kind of reuse license you want to put on it? A lot of the times, researchers use CC0, which is the most open licensing. However, some opt for CC BY, which is you can reuse this data as long as you cite me. So something to think about. This is a lot of information. We could talk about it later individually, but you might encounter this in the future, just so you know what the landscape looks like. Okay. And next. And I just wanted to bring it all together so that we can actually end on time. So all of these components that we talked about today are part of a DMP, a data management plan. This is typically what researchers use when they're submitting a grant to a federal funding agency. However, it is also kind of a living document that helps you keep track of managing your projects, your research. And I would encourage you to think about these questions in relation to your project. So what are the data types you're going to be creating and in what format? What form of documentation will be occurring? Who is responsible for making sure that this data is accessible? Whether that's backing up the data or putting it into a format for long-term access. What are the policies for sharing? Like, do you expect to share it with anyone? Is it just your colleagues or is it with other researchers? And how do you make it, like I said, accessible for long-term use? Okay, so that was a lot. So thank you for your time and attention. I hoped this workshop helped you feel more confident about some steps you can do to better manage your data and some questions that you can ask yourself as you're moving through your project timeline to consider what you could be doing differently or what are things you want to incorporate. I'm going to put a link into chat with the Google Drive folder that contains these slides so that you can use them for reference later on. I am also going to be putting a link to Qualtrics in the chat if you want to tell me what went well, what you learned from this presentation, and what are things that could be changed or that you would like to hear about in the future. If you liked this presentation or you want to learn more uh, about data management, I'm going to point you to 2 more workshops that we're doing this coming semesters. There's tips for visualizing your data, which is coming up in October. And if you have human subjects research, I would encourage you to attend the workshop in November, which is going to talk about all the things about managing a research project that has a human component in it. I'm also running a workshop on organizing your data in spreadsheets if you want to dig more into that aspect, if you have tabular data. And finally, I am also here as a resource for you if you need personalized assistance, whether with data management, creating a project workflow, finding data, or any other data needs. If you're not sure where to go, feel free to contact me. You can either schedule a consultation or you can email me. I'm happy to chat about your projects, no matter where you are in your data lifecycle. And I'm also happy to take any questions you have right now, either through chat or if you would like to unmute yourself. So thank you very much.